From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Officials in the city of Boulder say they have a problem: too many parking spaces. Now, if that didn't seem like a problem to you the last time you parked your car before a visit to the Pearl Street Mall, consider this. Some transportation experts believe having too many empty spots is basically a waste of space that could be used for housing or retail or a park. By some estimates, Boulder has twice as many parking spots as it needs. Now, some Boulder leaders say that is a missed opportunity in a city that struggles to make space for attainable housing. In fact, several Colorado cities are wrestling with this issue now. Boulder City Council member Ryan Schuhard says it's partly about the money.
So parking is actually very expensive for the city. Costs a lot of money to create parking spaces, much of which somebody has to pay for. It also takes up a huge amount of land space. Each parking space can take up nearly 200 square feet. Some people might recognize that that's about the space that an accessory dwelling unit or a small house might require.
Sure.
And the federal government tells us that more than 5% of urban land area, such as in towns like Boulder, is covered by parking. This is space we could use for a lot of better things.
And I'm curious, do you get complaints from residents about too much parking?
So the question generally isn't, do we have too much parking? The question is, why don't we have more money as a city to pay for the things we need? Why is it so hard to build more housing? And why don't we have better functioning transit and more bikeways? These are all things that take resources that the city is currently using for surface parking and for parking requirements.
Well, this is a perfect time then to talk about one of the factors behind this conundrum is a concept called minimum parking requirements. Boulder City Code requires developers to provide at least one off-street parking spot per housing unit, more parking even for that for commercial development. Could you talk about the downside of the minimum parking requirements?
Sure. So big picture, when you think about driving, you often think about the car, but it's just as much and probably more so the experience of driving is about our fine-tuned system of roads and parking. So parking is a big part of that. You often think of parking in terms of what the public provides in the public right-of-way, and which might charge an hourly rate for it, but more likely charges very little or nothing. But then the other side of this is the policy that is called parking minimums. And this is when the city creates requirements for private property owners who are maybe developing housing or other places like businesses where people work and shop, a requirement for them to build infrastructure for parking at their own expense. That expense gets passed on to someone.
How does it get passed on to someone?
Well, first of all, this is a relatively large amount of space in a property that where a developer is looking to build housing. Mm-hmm. So the first cost of a requirement for parking is that they're not building housing there instead. So the cost of the housing that does exist is relatively more expensive, and that gets passed on to the owner, and then the owner will be looking to pass it on to the tenant.
Ryan, I want to zoom out for a moment and talk about where the concept of minimum parking requirements came from. When did cities like Boulder start requiring so much parking, and why?
It comes from a constellation of public policy decisions in the 1960s, around there, to create single-family zoning that would emphasize people living in suburbs outside of cities, that emphasized highway building, and that started to focus most of our public investment on developing streets for cars. So since around then, we've had 80% or more of our federal funding for transportation go to car infrastructure. And so around that time, there was a policy direction to build cities around cars.
Right. And so we think about roads and highways with multiple lanes, but this also applies to parking.
That's exactly right. I sometimes think about this as roads are the matter and the parking is the antimatter in this equation. And we know from scholarship and research that we induce driving. We induce driving through capacity on roads and in parking.
Sure.
We can also induce people to ride transit and induce people to ride bikes by making those systems work well. The governing force here is public investment, and we've made a decision starting again about 70 years ago to really focus on cars.
So Ryan, Boulder planners are looking at eliminating these mandatory minimums, right? Who is pushing back against this idea, and what are their concerns?
This is one of those policies that's kind of straightforward once you get into it. Over 70 cities have eliminated parking minimums in the US.
Mhm.
You may not have heard about this because it's actually not very dramatic. This is not about eliminating parking, but rather eliminating the requirement for developers to build parking. And the good news is developers who want to build parking will still do so. And we've seen that when proposals have come to the city and a developer has installed parking that is
Mhm.
higher than they're required to.
Okay.
And if you use your imagination and just say, well, what if the housing developers just stopped building parking altogether? That outcome is also not very exotic. What you see in cities where there's a high demand for parking is that businesses or even households, they just offer parking at a market price, and it takes hold on its own.
And when you say they offer parking at a market price, what does that mean? Like not free parking, but
Yeah, so for example, a private parking lot entrepreneur might say, park here for parking. Anywhere where there's a demand for parking, there's almost certainly going to be somebody who's willing to sell it.
so, Ryan, there's also a new state law requiring some reduction in mandatory parking minimums. I believe these are namely for housing and offices that are near public transit. What is Boulder planning to do here that other cities wouldn't be doing?
Well, I speak only for myself as one city council member, but what I can tell you is that we will, first of all, need to update our city code to incorporate that. And we had previously made a decision to consider a more broad parking policy and transportation demand management reform. So our city council will be looking at that within the coming year. We've already started the proceeding, and I think one of the obvious questions is, do we just do the minimum that the state requires us, or do we go further and say, let's just eliminate parking minimums altogether?
Is there a possibility, Ryan, that this could lead to the problem of not enough parking in a few years?
I don't think so, Erin. First of all, if a developer of housing or another facility sees a reason to build parking, they'll ask to do so in their development proposal, and that will be a conversation. And I think the bigger opportunity is that as we start to use our resources better with land use, we'll have housing that allows people to live closer to where they need to go. And it will allow people who now live there to be subscribers to public transit and bikeways and be a part of providing the resources to make these systems work well. But the big opportunity is that this will create more resources for the city to pay for shared public amenities like public transit and better bikeways and give more people a chance to live near those resources where they live.
Ryan Schuhart is a Boulder City Council member. Leaders in other Colorado cities may be wrestling with similar questions about parking very soon. As Ryan mentioned, a new state law limits parking minimums around bus stops, train stations, and other transit hubs. The goal is to encourage more housing and less parking in those areas. We'll share links to more reporting on this from our friends at Boulder Reporting Lab in our show notes and at kunc.org. That's it for us today on In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thanks for listening.